The elevator doors whispered shut behind her, and Clara Hayes found herself standing on the 39th floor of Everest Global Holdings, her heart hammering against her ribs, as though it wanted to escape. She had never been in a building like this before. Towering glass, polished marble, air that smelled faintly of citrus and power. It was the kind of place where people moved quickly, where ambition gleamed in their eyes, and where she felt like a misplaced puzzle piece no one knew what to do with. She tightened her grip on the worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder. Inside were the papers she had stayed up half the night preparing, the proposal that she hoped, prayed, and nearly begged would be accepted. This was her one chance, her one moment, the thread of hope she had been chasing for years. Clara was not born into this world of sharp suits and sparkling shoes. She came from Brookside, a town that most maps didn't even bother to label. A childhood spent helping her mother keep the library alive, tutoring neighborhood kids who couldn't afford lessons, teaching herself late at night under the dim glow of a second-hand lamp. She had no expensive degree to frame on the wall, no powerful name to open doors. What she did have was persistence, the kind that kept her moving even when she wanted to collapse. She was supposed to be heading to conference room 14, where a group of executives had agreed reluctantly to hear her pitch for a new literacy program. Clara had memorized every hallway from the map emailed to her, but maps never accounted for nerves. Somewhere between the sleek glass elevators and the endless rows of identical doors, she had lost her bearings. Her watch told her she was already late. The bus delay had eaten the cushion of time she'd planned. She inhaled deeply, pressing her back against the cool wall, and whispered to herself the words that had become her shield. You belong here, even if they don't see it, you belong. A sharp click echoed down the hallway. Clara flinched, her eyes darting toward the sound. A cleaning cart stood abandoned near the corner, the janitor nowhere in sight. The place felt deserted, hushed, like a church at midnight. She glanced at the doors again, searching for the brass plate with the number 14 etched into it. Her gaze fell on one door, just slightly ajar, golden light spilling from within. Her pulse quickened. That must be it. Maybe they're waiting. Maybe they're already irritated that I'm late. Clara hurried toward it, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She paused at the threshold, steadying herself. The nameplate looked blurred in the glare, but she didn't stop to double-check. She pushed the door gently, stepping inside. The air felt different here, warmer, thicker, laced with the scent of cedar and something faintly metallic. Instead of the sterile conference table she expected, she saw a massive desk carved from dark wood, its surface gleaming like still water. Tall bookshelves climbed the walls, lined with leather-bound volumes and framed photographs. To her left, a leather sofa waited in the shadows, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawl of the city, painted by sunset. Clara froze. This wasn't a conference room. This was someone's private office. Her throat tightened as realization struck her. She should leave, close the door quietly, pretend she had never been here. But then she heard it, a low sound, steady and rhythmic, water cascading somewhere nearby. Her logical mind whispered, a leak. Maybe the pipes burst. You should tell someone, don't just leave it. Clara had always been the type to step in, even when it meant stepping out of her comfort zone. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space until she saw it. A door slightly open on the far side of the office. Steam drifted lazily through the crack, curling like smoke. Her heart raced. Every instinct screamed for her to turn around. But another thought tugged harder. What if something's wrong? What if someone needs help? She took a step forward, then another, her shoes soundless against the thick carpet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. She pushed it open just enough to peer inside, her breath catching in her throat as the scene unfolded before her. Behind a wall of frosted glass stood a figure, water cascading down in silver streams. The shape was tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly still, as though the person carried a weight too heavy to shake off. The shower's spray blurred details, but Clara knew instantly this wasn't just anyone. This was someone important, someone who didn't expect an audience in his most unguarded moment. Panic surged through her chest. She stumbled back, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Heat rushed to her face, and the satchel nearly slipped from her shoulder. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, one that could end her chances before they even began. But before she could retreat, a voice cut through the sound of water low, commanding, and sharp. "Who's there?" The words froze her where she stood. The figure behind the glass shifted, the outline moving toward the blurred doorway. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to speak, to explain, to vanish. But her voice lodged in her throat, caught between fear and apology. The door creaked open wider, steam spilling into the office, and in that charged moment, Clara realized she wasn't just trespassing into a stranger's space. She was standing at the threshold of a story she never expected, one that would alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Her next choice, whether to stay or to run, would decide everything. Clara's breath still trembled in her chest as the deep voice echoed in the room. She spun, clutching her satchel to her chest as though it could shield her from the gravity of what had just happened. Her mind screamed for her to run, to disappear before the consequences could crash down, but her feet refused to obey. It felt as though the carpet itself had turned to quicksand beneath her shoes. The sound of the water ceased. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the drip of droplets and the low shuffle of movement. Clara's pulse climbed higher with every passing second. She dared a glance back at the door she had come through, the one that could carry her to safety. But her body stayed rooted. Something beyond fear held her there, something she couldn't yet name. Then the figure appeared, no longer a blur behind glass, but a presence that filled the doorway with startling immediacy. Dark hair clung wetly to his forehead, a towel slung low across his shoulders, water trailing down his arms in rivulets that caught the dying light of the setting sun. He wasn't angry at first glance, nor startled. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that burned straight through her hurried apologies before she could speak them. "I am sorry," Clara stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought I was looking for a conference room. I didn't mean." Her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. She wanted the floor to swallow her, to erase the heat from her cheeks and the shame pressing down on her ribs. But he didn't interrupt. He let her flounder, his gaze fixed, assessing, like a man accustomed to seeing through facades. "You're not one of my staff," he finally said, his tone smooth but sharp, like a blade sheathed in silk, "and you don't look like you belong in this tower at this hour. So, tell me, who are you?" The question cut deeper than it should have. Who was she? A nobody from Brookside? A girl who barely scraped enough money to afford the bus fare here? Or someone reckless enough to chase a dream into the lion's den, only to stumble in uninvited? Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to lift her chin despite the tremor in her hands. "My name is Clara Hayes," she whispered, then steadier. "I came to deliver a proposal for the literacy initiative, but I must have taken a wrong turn." Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of literacy, though it vanished quickly beneath a mask of indifference. He stepped further into the office, movements unhurried, confident, as though every second belonged to him alone. Clara couldn't look away, caught between awe and dread. "You walked into my private office," he said, not an accusation, more like a statement of fact, but one that carried the weight of a verdict. Her throat tightened. "I'll leave immediately. I didn't mean to intrude." She turned, fumbling with the strap of her satchel, ready to flee before he could say another word. But his voice, calm and commanding, halted her. "Wait." It wasn't loud, but it carried enough force to root her in place. She turned back slowly, heart still drumming. He had moved closer now, not unkindly, but with the aura of someone who rarely needed to repeat himself. His eyes, gray, sharp as stormlight, were fixed on her face, searching, as though he were trying to read the truth behind her words. "Why you?" he asked. "Why is someone like you carrying a proposal instead of hiding behind whoever drafted it?" Clara blinked, startled by the question. She hadn't expected curiosity, only dismissal. "Because no one else would," she said softly. "Everyone at the library thought it was too intimidating. They said he wouldn't listen. But I couldn't just let the chance go." She bit her lip, realizing how small her voice sounded in such a vast, gleaming office. "So, I volunteered, because if there's even a sliver of hope, I had to try for the first time." The faintest curve touched his lips, not quite a smile, more like intrigue sharpening at the edges. He studied her another long moment, then tilted his head, as though silently weighing something against the ticking clock in his mind. Hope, he repeated, almost to himself. Then louder, most people don't come here with that. They come with ambition, or greed, or fear. You're different. Clara didn't know how to answer. She only knew that her knees still wobbled beneath her, and that she wanted desperately to prove she wasn't as out of place as she felt. Before she could speak again, a phone on his desk buzzed, breaking the fragile silence. He didn't move to answer it. His eyes stayed on her, unwavering, as though the world outside that office didn't exist. You should leave, he said finally, but the weight in his voice didn't sound like rejection. It sounded like a test. Come back tomorrow, 10 o'clock, with your proposal. Her eyes widened. Tomorrow, you'll hear it. A single nod, no hesitation. Clara's chest swelled with a flood of relief so strong it nearly unsteadied her. She nodded quickly, clutching the satchel tighter. Thank you, she whispered, though the words felt too small for the magnitude of the moment. He gave no reply, only turned back toward the side room as though dismissing her with silence. Clara stumbled toward the door, her pulse still racing, her mind spinning with disbelief, somehow, against all odds. Her mistake had turned into an invitation. As she stepped into the dim hallway, closing the office door behind her, she leaned back against the cool wall and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Tomorrow. She repeated the word in her mind, each syllable sparking both terror and anticipation. Whatever tomorrow held, she knew one thing for certain: nothing in her life would ever be the same again. And deep inside her, a voice she hadn't heard in years whispered with fierce clarity, don't let this slip away. Morning. Sunlight spilled over the rooftops of the city, glinting off towers of glass and steel as though the world itself had been freshly polished. Clara Hayes stood outside the revolving doors of Everest Global Holdings, clutching her satchel like a lifeline. Her heart thudded hard enough to make her breath short, and though she had rehearsed every line of her presentation until the words etched themselves into her dreams, all she could think now was, what if I fail? She had hardly slept the night before. Her mind kept replaying the scene in the private office, the sound of water, the commanding voice, the unshakable eyes of the man who had caught her in the most humiliating mistake of her life. Yet, instead of throwing her out, he had told her to return, 10 o'clock, with her proposal. The memory alone was enough to keep her trembling. The security guard by the front desk raised a brow when she gave her name, then checked a list and nodded stiffly. You're expected. Take the elevator to the top floor. Expected. The word sent a strange jolt through her chest. She had never been expected anywhere in her life, at least not like this. With unsteady steps, she moved toward the elevators. Each second felt stretched, suspended, as though fate itself was pausing to watch what she would do next. By the time the doors opened onto the executive floor, her nerves were raw threads. She adjusted her simple blazer, brushed her hands against the fabric of her skirt, and forced herself forward. She remembered his voice, the steadiness, the weight it carried. Dan reminded herself that turning back was no longer an option. The receptionist outside the grand double doors barely glanced up from her screen. Mr. Everhart will see you now. So that was his name. She had known of him from headlines. Of course, Adrian Everhart, the billionaire who built a global empire from code and vision. But knowing his name and standing in his presence were entirely different things. Clara pushed the doors open, her breath hitching as she stepped into the vast office once again. The man stood at the window this time, a tall silhouette framed by sunlight pouring in through the glass walls. His suit was dark, immaculately cut, a sharp contrast to the vulnerability she had glimpsed the night before. He didn't turn at first, letting her footsteps echo against the polished floor until she stopped a few feet away. You came, he said finally, his voice calm, unhurried. You told me to, Clara replied, her tone more steady than she felt. He turned then, and she was caught once more by the intensity of his gaze, up close. He seemed carved from quiet resolve, a man who had long ago learned how to command a room without raising his voice. He gestured toward the desk, Let's hear it. Her throat tightened. She pulled the proposal from her satchel, the papers trembling only slightly in her hands. She placed them before him and began. At first her voice wavered, each word scraping against the wall of nerves inside her. But as she spoke of the children in Brookside who had no books of their own, of the libraries struggling to keep doors open, of the power of literacy to change lives, something in her voice strengthened. She saw him watching her, not impatiently, but intently, as though weighing each word. His expression gave little away, but his silence demanded more from her, more passion, more conviction, more of the truth she had carried with her all these years. So she gave it. She told him about her mother, how she had fought to keep the library alive even when funding ran dry, about the boy she once tutored, who went from failing grades to graduating with honors simply because someone had given him the time to read. She spoke until her throat felt raw, her heart laid bare in words she hadn't even planned. When the silence finally stretched between them, Clara realized she had leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as though she could hold her dream in place by sheer will. She swallowed, stepping back slightly, embarrassed by the force of her own emotions. Adrian Everhart leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. For a long moment, he said nothing. The quiet stretched until Clara's chest constricted with dread. Had she said too much? Had she let her passion slip into desperation? Then he spoke. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said softly, almost to himself. His gaze drifted briefly toward the window, as though lost in memory, before returning to her. "Most people come here asking for millions with nothing but empty words. You came with conviction. That matters." Her breath caught. She hadn't realized she was still holding it until that moment. He rose from his chair, tall and commanding, and walked to the window once more. "But conviction alone doesn't change the world. You'll need more than hope if you wanted to build what you're asking for. You'll need allies, resources, discipline." Clara's heart sank, afraid this was his way of dismissing her. But then he turned back, and there was something sharper in his expression now, something that looked like possibility. "I'll fund your initiative," he said, and before she could exhale in relief, he added, "on one condition." Her fingers tightened on the strap of her satchel. "Condition, you work with me," he replied, directly. "I don't waste resources on projects that fail. If you want this to succeed, I'll expect you here every day. You'll learn how to build more than a dream. You'll learn how to make it unshakable." The words stunned her. Work with him? Side by side with the most intimidating man she had ever met. It was too much, too sudden, too impossible. Yet the fire inside her, the one that had pushed her to volunteer, to stumble into his office, to stand here, now flared brighter. Clara met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a girl lost in a world too big for her. She felt like someone on the edge of something extraordinary. "Yes," she said, her voice firm despite the storm within her. "I'll do it." For the faintest moment, his expression softened, not into a smile, but into something that hinted at approval. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual calm authority. "Good," he said simply. "Then your work begins tomorrow." As she left the office, Clara's thoughts swirled in a dizzying storm of fear and exhilaration. The path before her was nothing like she had imagined. It was bigger, riskier, and infinitely more daunting. But it was real. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, she whispered the words again. The same words that had carried her this far. "You belong here. Don't let this slip away." This time, for the first time, she almost believed it. Clara woke the next morning long before the alarm. Sleep had been shallow, restless, a haze of half-dreams where she was back in that office, with Adrian Everhart's gray eyes pinning her in place. The words he had spoken the day before echoed in her mind, words she could not shake no matter how tightly she pulled the blanket around her shoulders. "You'll work with me." Directly. The thought was both terrifying and electrifying. All night she had swung between dread and exhilaration, imagining scenarios where she made a fool of herself, and others where she somehow managed to rise above her fears and prove she was capable. By dawn, she was no closer to believing she was ready, yet her feet moved anyway. That was the strange thing about courage. It never asked whether she felt prepared. It only demanded that she show up. The morning air outside bit cold against her skin, crisp with the smell of rain. Brookside was a world away from this city of gleaming towers, and Clara felt that distance more acutely now than ever. Her blazer was pressed but modest, her shoes polished but plain. She had no designer labels to hide behind, no connections to call upon. What she had was a worn satchel, a belief in the power of words, and a stubborn determination that refused to let her turn back. By the time she stepped once more into the elevator that rose toward the top of Everest Global Holdings, Clara's palms were damp, her pulse quick and insistent. The mirrored walls reflected her nervous expression back at her, and she forced herself to straighten her spine, to lift her chin. "You belong here," she whispered under her breath, the mantra that had carried her this far. The elevator opened to the same hushed hallway, though today it felt different. Yesterday she had been an intruder, a girl who stumbled into the wrong room. Today she had been summoned, expected. That difference alone carried a strange weight. The receptionist barely looked up when Clara approached. "He's waiting." Clara's heart lurched at the words. She smoothed her blazer, inhaled deeply, and pushed open the heavy doors. The office was flooded with morning light, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Adrian Everhart stood not behind his desk this time, but near a side table, pouring coffee into 2 cups. He glanced up when she entered, and for a moment, Clara swore she caught something unspoken in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You're on time," he said. "I figured that was the least I could manage," Clara replied, though her voice trembled slightly. He set 1 cup on the desk and gestured for her to sit. She crossed the room, lowering herself carefully into the chair opposite him. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. It felt like a test, like he was gauging how long she could hold her ground without flinching. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know why I agreed to see you again?" Clara swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "Because I wouldn't let go of the idea. Because I believed in it enough to face you when no one else would." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close, partly, but more because I wanted to see whether your conviction lasts longer than one night. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Passion fades, determination doesn't. Which one are you?" Clara's pulse quickened. She wanted to answer immediately, to say the right thing, but she forced herself to pause. This man didn't want rehearsed lines. He wanted truth. "I'm both," she said finally. "Passion is why I'm here. Determination is why I'll keep showing up." He studied her in silence, then leaned back, nodding slightly. "Good answer." Relief fluttered through her chest, but it was short-lived. Adrian slid a thick folder across the desk toward her. "If you're going to work with me, you'll need to start here. These are the logistics budgets, projections, timelines. You'll be expected to understand them." Clara opened the folder, her eyes widening at the maze of charts and numbers inside. It was more than she had ever dealt with, far more complicated than the simple proposals she had prepared before. Doubt rose quickly, but she pushed it back down. "Don't show fear." "Not now. I'll learn," she said firmly. He inclined his head, as though that was the only acceptable response. For the next hour, he walked her through the basics, not with the patience of a teacher, but with the precision of a man who expected competence. He spoke in clipped sentences, his focus unwavering, and though the pace left her scrambling to keep up, Clara found herself absorbing more than she expected. It wasn't easy, but each time she stumbled, she forced herself back into stride. By the end, Adrian closed the folder and regarded her quietly. "Most people drown in the first hour. You didn't." Clara's throat tightened. Was that praise? From him, it felt like it. "I'll need you here tomorrow at 6, he continued. "We don't waste daylight." Her eyes widened. 6 in the morning. His gaze didn't waver. "Is that a problem?" She thought of the library back in Brookside, of the children who waited for books that never came, of the dreams she carried like fragile glass. She shook her head. "No, I'll be here." Something flickered again in his expression, approval, or perhaps surprise, but once more, it was gone in an instant. As she gathered her things to leave, Clara's mind buzzed with exhaustion and exhilaration. She had survived her first real morning with Adrian Everhart, and though the road ahead looked impossibly steep, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she wasn't just asking for a chance. She was taking one. When she stepped into the hallway, the doors closing softly behind her, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. The fear was still there. Yes, but layered over it now was something new, something stronger. Hope. Sharper and brighter than before. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The hardest battles were still to come, and the man she was working with carried secrets she had yet to uncover. But one thing was clear. Her life was no longer her own quiet story. It was about to intertwine with something far bigger, something that could either break her completely or shape her into someone unrecognizable. The thought both terrified and thrilled her, and as she walked toward the elevator, her hands still trembling, Clara whispered the words again. The words that had become her anchor. Don't let this slip away. Only now, she realized. Those words no longer sounded like a plea. They sounded like a promise. Clara stood at the bus stop before dawn, the city still cloaked in gray shadows. The streetlights flickered faintly, and the cold bit at her cheeks, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, chasing after the day that awaited her. 6 in the morning. Adrian Everhart hadn't been exaggerating when he said they didn't waste daylight. She clutched her satchel close, not because she needed anything inside it, but because the worn leather grounded her, reminded her of where she came from and why she had chosen this path. The ride into the city was quiet, filled with the hum of the engine and the occasional cough of the driver. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the skyline grow nearer, each tower stretching higher as the horizon began to glow. She whispered the words again, the ones that had carried her through sleepless nights and trembling moments. You belong here. By the time she stepped through the revolving doors of Everest Global Holdings, the lobby was nearly empty. A few early employees strode past her with steaming coffee cups and sharp focus, their heels clicking against the marble floor. Clara's shoes felt too soft, her presence too small. But she pushed the thought aside. She was here now. When the elevator opened onto the top floor, she found the office already lit. Adrian stood at the long table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, papers spread across the polished surface. His attention was fixed on the documents before him, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't look up until she approached. "You're on time," he said, the same words as yesterday, but this time they carried a note of approval. Clara nodded, trying to steady her nerves. "I said I'd be good," he replied, then gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit. We have work." For the next several hours, Clara was thrown into a storm of numbers, charts, and strategies. Adrian's pace was relentless, his expectations clear. He didn't pause for her to catch up, yet somehow he always knew when she was about to falter. His sharp gaze would flick to hers, and though he said nothing, the weight of it steadied her more than any words could. She found herself keeping up, barely at times, but enough. When the clock struck 9, he finally leaned back in his chair, setting his pen aside. "Not bad," he said. Clara exhaled, realizing how tightly she had been gripping her pen. "Thank you," she murmured. Though exhaustion tugged at her, Adrian studied her quietly. "Most people crumble under pressure. You don't." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then answered truthfully, "Because I can't afford to. Where I come from, if you give up, you lose everything. And I've lost enough already." Something shifted in his expression, the faintest shadow passing over his features. For a moment, Clara wondered if she had said too much, if she had revealed more of herself than she should. But instead of dismissing her, he stood abruptly and crossed to one of the tall bookshelves lining the wall. He pulled down a leather-bound volume, placed it on the table, and opened it to a page filled with handwritten notes. "Read this," he said. Clara leaned forward, scanning the words. They weren't business projections or financial reports. They were plans, personal, almost intimate, outlining an early vision for something strikingly similar to what she had proposed: literacy programs, community learning centers, outreach for children without access to education. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was looking at. This was yours," she whispered. Adrian's gaze lingered on the pages, his jaw tightening. A long time ago, before the company consumed everything else, his voice was quiet, almost distant. I wanted to build something that mattered, beyond profit. But dreams have a way of slipping through your fingers when the world demands more than you can give. Clara looked up at him, stunned. She had never expected to see this side of him. The man behind the headlines and steel gray eyes. There was something vulnerable in the way he stood, as though the weight of his own past pressed down on him even now. Why show me this? She asked softly. His gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. Because I want to see if you can carry what I couldn't. Or maybe, if together we can build something that lasts. The words struck her deeply, a spark igniting in her chest. She realized then that this wasn't just about her proposal anymore. It was about something larger. Something rooted in both their stories: his abandoned vision, her relentless hope. Before she could respond, the phone on his desk rang sharply, breaking the moment. Adrian's expression hardened as he answered. His tone clipped. Clara could only hear fragments, board members, pushback, deadlines. His jaw tightened with every word. When he hung up, the room felt heavier. Not everyone will support this, he said, his voice grim. They'll see it as a waste of resources, a distraction. Clara's chest tightened, but she lifted her chin. Then we proved them wrong, for the first time. Adrian's lips curved into something unmistakable, a faint, rare smile. You speak as though it's already possible, because it is, she replied, surprising herself with the conviction in her tone. If you believed it once, you can believe it again, and I'm not letting go of this, no matter who stands in the way. Adrian studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Good, you'll need that fire, because the fight ahead won't be easy. Clara felt her pulse quicken, a mix of fear and exhilaration. She didn't know what battles lay ahead. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had stepped into something much bigger than herself. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the size of the dream. As she left his office later that day, the city stretching wide and bright below, Clara whispered the words once more, words that no longer felt like borrowed courage, but like her own truth. You belong here. This time, she believed it with her whole heart. The boardroom was colder than Clara had imagined, not in temperature, but in presence. The long glass table stretched like a frozen river, lined with men and women in immaculate suits, their eyes sharp, their expressions carefully neutral. They were the board members of Everest Global Holdings, the people who held power not only over Adrian Everhart's empire but, indirectly, over the fragile dream Clara had placed in his hands. She sat near the end of the table, her satchel tucked beneath her chair, her palms damp against the folder she clutched. She had told herself she was ready, but the weight of those eyes made her feel small, as though her very existence here was a mistake. At the head of the table, Adrian leaned back in his chair, calm and unyielding. He radiated authority in a way no one else in the room did, but Clara could sense it, the tension, the quiet battle of wills simmering just beneath the polished surface. One of the board members, a man with silver hair and a voice as cold as the table itself, spoke first. Mr. Everhart, I don't understand why we're entertaining this discussion at all. Philanthropy may look good in headlines, but diverting resources from core ventures is reckless. We built this company on profit, not charity. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Clara's throat tightened. She wasn't meant to speak, yet this was Adrian's domain, his battlefield, but her pulse thudded with urgency. Every dismissive glance, every skeptical tone was a reminder of the stakes. Adrian's voice cut through the murmurs, steady and sharp. This is not charity, it's investment. An investment in the very communities that shape our future workforce, our markets, our reputation. The silver-haired man scoffed, spoken like an idealist. You know as well as I do, idealism doesn't pay dividends. Clara's hands trembled beneath the table. She wanted to stay silent, to let Adrian fight this fight. But then she remembered the children in Brookside, their eager faces pressed against the glass of a library that had nothing new to offer. She remembered her mother's weary smile, holding on to hope even as funding dried up, if she stayed quiet. Now, what was the point of coming this far? Before she realized it, Her voice broke into the room. "With respect, sir," she said, her words quivering but clear, "you're wrong." The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes snapped toward her. Heat flooded Clara's face, but she forced herself to go on. "This isn't about idealism, it's about reality. Children who grow up without access to books, to basic literacy, they're not just forgotten, they're lost. And when they're lost, so is the potential they could have brought to the world. That's not charity, that's waste, that's opportunity slipping through our fingers." Her voice grew steadier with every word. "I've seen it. I've lived it. I grew up in a town where the library was the only place children had to dream, beyond what they saw every day, and even then, it was barely surviving. But the kids who learned to read, who had someone believe in them, they thrived. They went on to college, to careers, to lives they never thought possible. That is what this program is about. Not handouts, hope, opportunity, transformation." Silence hung heavy in the room. Clara's chest heaved with the force of her words, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped. But then, slowly, Adrian turned his head toward her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were steady, as though he had been waiting for this. Another board member, a woman with sharp features, leaned forward. "And who exactly are you, Miss Hayes, to lecture us on opportunity?" Clara's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. "Someone who knows what it's like to be overlooked, and someone who refuses to let others be." The woman's brow arched, but she said nothing. The room seemed to shift, the once certain opposition now unsettled by Clara's presence, by the rawness of her conviction. Adrian spoke then, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of finality. "You've heard her, you've heard me. The decision is yours, but understand this, Everest will move forward with this initiative, with or without unanimous support." The silver-haired man leaned back, scowling, but he didn't argue. One by one, the others exchanged glances, the fight bleeding from their expressions. Resistance still lingered, but it was quieter now, weaker. When the meeting finally adjourned, Clara gathered her things with shaking hands. As the board members filed out, some casting her skeptical looks, others something closer to reluctant respect, she felt a storm of emotion surge inside her. Fear, relief, pride. Adrian remained seated, watching her with that same unreadable gaze. When the last board member left, the silence between them stretched. Finally, he spoke. "You didn't crumble," he said softly. Clara swallowed, unsure whether he meant it as praise or observation. "I couldn't," she whispered. For the first time, his expression softened, just slightly. "Good. Because this was only the beginning." Her pulse quickened. She knew he was right. The board was only the first wall they had to climb. There would be more obstacles, more battles, more voices telling her she didn't belong. But she also knew something else now, something she hadn't fully realized until this moment. She wasn't standing alone anymore. That as she left the boardroom, her hands still trembling, Clara felt a fierce determination ignite within her. Whatever storms lay ahead, she would face them, for Brookside, for the children, for the dream that had carried her here. And for the first time in her life, the words she whispered to herself were not just a shield, they were a vow. "You belong here, and you will not be forgotten."